Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm sure you're more so here to hear about the awesome things that you have going on than about these boring whales, right? So yes, I am with the Oceanwise Research Institute. Oceanwise, who here has heard of Oceanwise before? Yeah, that's great. A lot of people have heard of it. We do a whole bunch of different things. Oceanwise is involved with seafood, sustainable seafood recommendations. The Vancouver Aquarium is also an Oceanwise initiative. But also we do a lot of different research as well, largely focused around British Columbia, but there's quite a bit of other research as well. I'll be talking a little bit about that. More specifically, I'll be talking about the BC Citation sighting network. So Citation is a fancy word for whales, dolphins, and porpoises, and that's what I am here to talk about. Just to give you a bit of an idea as to what this presentation covers, first I'll just briefly tell you what the BC Citation sighting network is. And how my work is kind of involved with that. And then the largest chunk of the presentation is Whales 101, just talking about some of the different whales, dolphins, and porpoises that live in this part of the world. We're really, really lucky to have so many different types of cetaceans that live in our waters, and you guys are, I imagine, probably lucky enough to get to see out in the wild, which is really fantastic. Then I'll kind of talk a little bit about some of the threats to cetaceans. Unfortunately, it isn't a perfect world out there for these animals, so I'll talk a little bit about some of the threats that they face. Then talk a little bit more about some of the research that we do and conservation action that we take to help protect these animals. And then lastly, talk about what you can do to help protect these animals. So, to start things off, as I mentioned, we are incredibly lucky. We live in an area where there are over 23 species of whales, dolphins, and porpoises, and 4 species of sea turtles. We like to throw them in there because they're a pretty cool animal as well. But all of these different animals like to spend time on the coast of British Columbia. It's absolutely awesome. Unfortunately, 12 of these populations are listed at risk under Canada's Species at Risk Act. That's why it's incredibly important that we come together to make sure that we are protecting these animals, and not just them, but their habitat as well. However, I'm a part of the Southern Vancouver Island Cetacean Research Initiative, so that big long name just to say that the marine mammal research program that is focused on the Southern Vancouver Island portion. Let me list all of the people in the program. It's me and my boss. It's very difficult for us to be able to monitor all of that area, particularly when you look at how big BC's coast is. There is over 25,000 kilometers of coastline in British Columbia. With only 2 people down here in the south, we are not going to be able to cover anywhere near to that area. That's why, instead, we rely on citizen scientists, so people like yourselves, to come and contribute your time and effort towards collecting data for us. So that is exactly what the BC Citation Sighting Network is. It's one of Canada's longest running and most successful citizen science programs. And what we do is we ask you to collect sightings of any cetaceans that you see when you're out on or near the water. So who these observers are, they can be anyone from people who are out on a sea kayak to people who are out recreational boating, other people who are out, who are more professional mariners, members of BC Ferries, or people who are out fishing, people who are a part of ecotourism. All of these people help contribute their sightings to us so that we can learn more about these animals. We have over 6,800 observers. That has now increased to over 7,000 observers, which is absolutely fantastic. What though that happens with those sightings, they come into us, we verify to make sure that they look somewhat correct. If someone is saying that there's a sperm whale smack dab in the middle of Nanaimo, it's probably wrong. They usually are found in the water. But we check to make sure that those sightings are correct, and we have quite a few of those sightings. This number is also incorrect. It says 119,000 sightings and counting. It's now over 200,000 sightings, which is really, really awesome. What those sightings are then used for is a whole bunch of different things. It's used to, just in short, conservation-based research. Not only research that we're doing, but we're able to supply those data for members of the public, as well as for different NGOs who are doing research conservation, to the government as well, for helping with designating marine protected areas. Many different types of research projects are used with these different sightings. So just to give you an idea as to what 119,000 sightings looks like, it's that, just a bunch of dots. Obviously you can see that The areas that are most densely populated have quite a few more sightings than out here in more the open ocean. That's more so where marine industry becomes involved, marine fisheries observers, as well as people who are out fishing themselves. Those are the people who are mainly going to be supporting those sightings. But as you can see, it's with recruiting all of these different people, we're able to get a much better idea and be able to cover a much larger area of the water. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit down into the Southern Gulf Islands here and also shrink the amount of time because it still would just look like a bunch of dots. So here we have the Southern Gulf Islands, and this is just from 2017 to present. And as you can see, it's still a huge number of sightings, which is absolutely fantastic. What we see here is over 1,600 sightings. The most common species that were found in this area were humpback whales, killer whales, harbor porpoise, and who's the next one on there? Dall's porpoise. These are just a number of sightings. That isn't saying that those are the exact areas where those animals are found. This is an effort corrected. So for instance, right through Active Pass here, it's very easy to see all of the water there. So people are probably going to be able to see animals more easily in that area than just out in the middle of the Strait of Georgia here. So just to give you an idea as to what those sightings look like on a little bit of a finer scale. So, to give you more idea what these sightings are used for, largely it's used for getting a better idea of where these animals' abundance, occurrence, and distribution are. So essentially where the animals are, where the hot spots might be, what areas are particularly important to them. We can use those to help identify special conservation areas, perhaps in developing marine protected areas. We share these data for conservation-based research projects, so that's not just us who are using the data, but many different people as well, so long as they apply and show that they are using it for conservation-based research. It's also used for increasing situational awareness for commercial mariners out on the water using something called the Whale Report Alert System. Don't worry, I'm going to talk about that later on once we get to some of the conservation points of the talk here. And then possibly soon, which is really exciting, these data are hopefully going to be providing real-time info for emergency response, environmental responders. So if there's some type of environmental emergency, such as an oil spill or something like that, we're going to be able to supply people who are responding to that in real time where cetaceans are being sighted so that they can make sure that they're concentrating their efforts to help mitigate the threats to those animals. So, a really fantastic thing. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about how you can help contribute to this sightings network. But first off, let's get into the whales. This is what we're all here to talk about, what we're all most interested on. So I'm going to be talking about some of the most common whales, not all 23 of those species that I mentioned before, just some of the most common ones that are found in this southern Vancouver Island region. But before you can identify a whale, you need to know what you're looking for. So here are some important things that you can use to help identify a whale when you're out on the water and you see a blow. So first off, the best thing to look for is general size, just how big that animal is. Is it the size of 2 semi-trucks? Is it the size of a Brontosaurus? I don't know why that's up there, not very useful. With something like a beluga, I don't even know what this is supposed to be. It just, to me, looks like 2 children who are playing in a sandbox, and I don't think that's correct. But getting a general idea of how big these animals are is going to be able to help you identify what species it is. Cetaceans can get anywhere from the size of 3 school buses long down to as small as the same height as me. So these animals do range very widely in how big they can be, and just getting a look at how big that animal is, you'll be able to identify what species it is possibly just based off of that. Also, taking a look at the dorsal fin shape. Does anyone know what whale that is in the middle picture there? Humpback, yeah, it has that very distinct humpy back. It has a little hump on its back. So you can, just by taking a look at its dorsal fin, that big hump of mass right behind that little fin that it has, you can tell that that is most likely a humpback whale. Also, I mentioned before, the blow, that shape of the blow as that animal comes to the surface and exhales, you can actually tell what species it is based off just the shape of that, even from very, very long distances. So for instance, these killer whales, they have a very bushy blow. It kind of looks like a big sphere that comes up just above the water. In comparison, a humpback has a very conical and tall blow. It's going to shoot 30 feet up into the air, going to be very, very distinct in comparison to an orca. So you're going to be able to tell those two animals apart very easily just upon that shape of that blow. If you get trained well enough, I've been told that you can tell species apart by the smell of the blow as well. Supposedly minke whales have particularly stinky blows. What they're doing, if they're not brushing their baleen or something, we're not entirely sure, but yeah, if you got a good enough nose, you might be able to get to that point. Otherwise, you can also take a look at the skin color and texture. It can be super, super useful in identifying a species. The gray whale here has very mottled skin. It makes it stand out from all of the other species. Also taking a look at whether or not the whale has any other things living on it. Gray whales and humpback whales as well often have barnacles living on them. Gray whales have a huge number of whale lice as well. These are little isopods that live exclusively on the backs of whales. They feed on dead skin, and sometimes if they scrape, they'll suck some of the blood from that area. A little bit creepy. What's super interesting is that every single whale species seems to have its own distinct species of whale lice. So they're very attuned to living exclusively on these animals, which is really, really cool. Then finally, one absolutely huge way that can be useful in identifying a species is taking a look at the behavior of the animal. And not just the animal itself, but all of the other wildlife it's associated with. So if an animal is showing its big flukes as it goes down for a dive, not all cetacean species will actually show those big tail flukes, those paddle-like structures on the end of their tail as they go for a dive. If you see that, that might be a good indication to what species it might be. If it's doing other different types of feeding behaviors, such as this kind of lunge behavior that this humpback is doing as it feeds. Also taking a look at the behaviors of animals around it. Are there any seals or sea lions who seem really, really skittish and on edge as they quickly jump out of the water? Might be a sign that there's a killer whale around. Taking a look at seabirds. If you see a huge congregation of seabirds that seem to be going after a herring ball, driving it into a tighter and tighter area from above, it also might be a sign that there's some animal that is hunting from underneath as well. So maybe there's a whale underneath there. So all of these different things you can use to help to identify your different species. So I'm going to be talking about some of these as we go into some of the different species here, just to give you an idea of different things that you can look for so you can better identify species when you're out on the water. Sound good? Feeling ready? Yep. All right, this one is pretty difficult. Who thinks that they could identify this species? I hope so. It's pretty charismatic. Hopefully you're going to be able to identify a killer whale, otherwise known as an orca. These animals can get quite large. A male can get up to 9 meters long. I think of that in comparison as about the same size as a Zodiac boat, if you've ever seen those out on the water. But obviously the things that stand out the most are the very distinct coloration, that black back, white underside, that white eye patch as well. Obviously that big tall dorsal fin, particularly with the males, is going to be super characteristic as well. And also that gray saddle patch. So that's that white area just behind the dorsal fin on the back of the animal that you're going to be able to identify it from. If you see an animal from further away and you just see its blow, you're going to be looking for kind of a spherical, bushy shaped blow just at the surface of the water. It's not going to be shooting up quite as high as some of the larger species. Now, I have faith that most of you would be able to identify one of these animals pretty easily. But what's interesting about killer whales is you can actually identify them a little bit more precisely than other species, with some fairly easy characteristics. First, you can identify what sex the animal is. Female killer whales, their dorsal fin is going to have kind of a recurved shape. So it's going to keep a curve throughout its entire life. As a killer whale is born, it's going to have a nice curved dorsal fin. And as it gets older, it's going to get a little bit more straight. But with the females, it's still going to retain some of that curve throughout its entire life. Whereas a male, once it reaches about 12 years old, so once it reaches its maturity, that dorsal fin is going to get much taller and much straighter. It can get up to 6 feet tall, so taller than I am, just to show you how big these animals are. And it's going to stay like that through most of its entire life. It might get a little bit saggy later on in life or get some ruffles along the back edge, but it's still going to maintain that big, tall, straight dorsal fin. Now, with juveniles, it can be a little bit harder to tell the sex just based off of that dorsal fin, because both males and females will have that curvature. So you are going to have to maybe go dive underneath that animal. I'm not recommending that. Please do not do that. But you can tell the sex of these animals apart based off of some genital markings, based off of the number of black dots that it has around its genital openings, but it's a little bit hard to see sometimes. One thing that is interesting is with particularly young killer whales, animals that are between 2 years or younger, they actually have a little bit of a yellow or even orange pigmentation around the whites of their body. So you're going to be able to, if you see an animal that has some of that, you're going to be able to tell that that's a particularly young individual, which is kind of cool. All right, so diving a little bit more into some of the different types of killer whales that there are out there. There is only one species of killer whale, but there is some debate about that because there are actually 10 different ecotypes. Another way of saying ecotypes, I kind of like to think of it as 10 different cultures of killer whale in the world. We're lucky enough to have 3 of them, these 3 in the top right, and to give you a little bit more detail, these are separated into the resident killer whales, the bigs or the transient killer whales, and the offshore killer whales. Now, their culture is different, partially based off of what they eat, but off of many different things as well, which I'll go into a little bit more detail. The resident killer whales, they're separated into 2 distinct groups as well, the northern residents and the southern residents, as I'm sure you've heard much talk about, particularly the southern residents are quite prominent in the media these days. With one fact that I learned fairly recently, which I thought was absolutely incredible, is resident killer whales and transient killer whales, they share very similar habitats. They're often seen very close to one another. It is estimated that these 2 lineages of killer whales split apart from each other evolutionary 700,000 years ago. So quite a long time. To give you an idea as to what that is in comparison to humans, humans and Neanderthals were expected to separate about the same time, around 800,000 to 700,000 years ago. So these 2 groups of animals have split apart a very long time ago just based off of this cultural separation. One thing that is interesting is with a trained eye or with a good camera, you can actually identify these 3 different ecotypes that we have in British Columbia apart based off of just some physical markings that they have on them. So, for instance, the resident killer whales, one thing to look for at the dorsal fin is they have a pointed dorsal fin, but it's pointed a little bit more towards the back of the animal. In comparison, the transient killer whales is pointed, but it's more pointed towards the top. Then with the offshore killer whales, first off, you usually find them offshore. That's a good hint, good indication. But taking a look at the dorsal fin, it's very rounded in comparison. Another thing you can look at is the saddle patch. In resident killer whales, they have what's called an open saddle patch. We can see here that there's a little bit of black crescent that kind of cuts down into that saddle patch, down towards the belly of the animal. Not all resident killer whales do have this, but many of them do, and it's a good indication that that is a resident killer whale. In comparison, the transient and the offshore killer whales, they have what's called a closed saddle patch. They don't have any of that black coloration cutting down into that gray area behind their dorsal fin. All right, ready for a quiz? Yes? That's what you signed up here for, is to do some quizzes, right? Taking a look at these, who here thinks resident killer whale? Who thinks transient? Who thinks offshore? Who didn't raise their hand? Yeah, you know what? The trees is probably a pretty good sign that those aren't offshore killer whales. Yes, that is true. These are residents. You can tell because of that pointed a little bit towards the back, right? You can't really see the open saddle patch very well in these individuals. Some of them might just be underwater, so and some of them don't really show it a very prominent version of that. So, how about these ones? Who thinks resident? Who thinks transient? Who thinks offshore? Well, I always say there's always one person who's just like, yeah, offshore, but you guys are smarter than that. Yes, these are transient killer whales. Once again, looking at that pointed, its dorsal fin pointed more towards the top of the animal. So, I've been using the term culture to describe these three different groups of animals. Ecotype is another way of describing them. The reason I use culture is because based off of a definition of culture where information and a way of living is passed on from one generation to another, these killer whales do exhibit some form of that. One example of that is based off of what they eat. Obviously, killer whales are able to, they're very fierce hunters. They'd be able to take down essentially anything in the ocean that they want to. With resident killer whales, they almost exclusively eat fish and almost exclusively eat salmonids. When I say salmonids, obviously I'm talking about salmon, and when you take a look at their diet, it seems to consist of almost 80 to 90% of Chinook salmon. This is because Chinook are quite a bit, have a higher fat content in comparison to some of the other salmon. So if you think of it as a kale salad and a Big Mac burger, obviously if you're just concerned about getting the most energy per bite you take, you're probably going to go for the Big Mac as opposed to the kale salad. No, not knocking kale. I had kale for dinner today, so it was very good. But I mean, it was beside a Big Mac burger, but that's beside the
You don't show any sockeye salmon there.
In this one here, this is based off of a study. Whether or not sockeye were involved in this in just a super small percentage, I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, this is a graph that is based off of one study, I should mention, from Ford and et al. In 2016. Yes?
Is the resident population number that you showed on the last slide, does that reflect northern and south?
That reflects northern and southern. So yeah, I'll be talking a little bit more about the numbers in just a moment here. Another form of culture that these animals have is based off of their social structure, so how they orient themselves with other killer whales in their group. They tend to travel in fairly large groups, but there is a very distinct and rigid structure that they follow. And it's almost entirely based around matriline. So what do I mean when I say matriline? It's a group of killer whales that you see is going to all be following one matriarch, the oldest female in that group. It is going to be her and her offspring, and then maybe her grandchildren as well. So this individual here, A294, born in 1967, is traveling here with her offspring. One male here is born in 1999. People often think if you see a pod of killer whales that it is, if you see a big male and a large female and then some other females coming around, people think that, oh, there's mom and dad and babies. It's actually mom and son and daughters. All male killer whales are all mama's boys. That's why I feel a strong connection with them. Male killer whales sometimes will go off by themselves every now and then. They might go off and get some food and then actually bring it back to mom as a gift, which is really cute. But yeah, it's you generally don't see a mated pair traveling together at any point in time, only for very brief periods of time. So, a matriline, this is the core structure of southern resident killer whales and all whales and all killer whales in general, I should say. If you have multiple matrilines that spend more than 50% of their time together, that is what constitutes a pod. Now, these pods can be grouped into different groups as well based off of the vocal dialects that they share. These are the whistles and clicks that distinguish them apart from other clans. Each clan has a separate distinct whistle, combination of whistles and clicks that they use to identify that they are a part of the same group. And then all of those clans can be grouped finally together as a population. So this, once again, just shows you what these matrilines kind of look like in a phylogenetic tree, as you can kind of see here. With the southern resident population, it consists of only one clan, J clan, which consists of 3 pods, J, K, and L. And then the northern population is quite a bit bigger. It has 3 clans, A clan, G clan, and R clan, with many different pods amongst all of those 3 clans.
Where do the males that are hanging out with their mothers, where do they find their mates?
So when they kind of form what's called a superpod. This is when 2 clans might come together and they have a little bit of fun, let's say. And it is a very big, boisterous occasion when that happens. They mate, they then go back into their separate clans, back to their separate pods, and go on their merry way from there. So, yeah.
Do the residents and the the other ones,
The transients?
Transients, do they interact?
In terms of mating, there isn't any indication that they do that. In terms of like interaction with saying hello or something like that.
Being in the same area, yes.
Yeah, they are. They do live in the exact same areas. Transients live all along BC's coast, and so do resident killer whales. So every now and then they might pass by each other, but
Not like
in terms of
gang wars.
not a very common thing to see for sure.
Do the northern and southern resident whales interact much?
Generally, no, because while their habitats do overlap, they overlap spatially but not temporally. So the northern residents are usually further north, while the southern residents are down here in this region, and then they kind of travel like this in concert. So they generally don't usually overlap in time. Every now and then it does occur, and particularly with the southern residents, they are doing some more, I don't want to say erratic behaviors, some different distributions than they have been in the past couple of years, so it might be changing a little bit in the near future. We'll have to see. But,
Thanks.
So when it comes to resident killer whales, under the Species at Risk Act, they are listed as both endangered and threatened. This is because the southern resident killer whales are considered endangered, while the northern residents are thankfully only threatened. The population of southern resident killer whales is, I say 73 in brackets 72. That 72 is the more likely confirmed number. Just a couple weeks ago, there was one individual who hasn't been seen with the pod for a very long time and is very likely has passed on. So their population is only 72 individuals. In comparison, there's around 280 individuals in the northern resident population, so thankfully they're doing quite a bit better. This shows the range of these two different species, and as you can see, there is quite a bit of overlap, but that why they're called southern and resident is based off of this critical habitat, so that yellow zone. For the southern residents, it's down in the Salish Sea here, whereas for the northern residents, it's up around Johnston Strait. This is where they're going to be spending a lot of their time, particularly during the summer months, where they're going to be getting a lot of their food and spending a lot of their time. So this is why we've separated them into these two different groups and where they get the name southern and northern resident. This is a graph just showing the southern resident population and how it's changed over time since 1975. The top purple line shows the entire southern resident population, and then the three lines underneath are the three different pods. We can see, this only goes until 2018, I believe, or 2019, but that was in November, whereas it was at 75, and it's already down to 72 as of January or February of this year, so we can see that these animals are in a bit of dire straits. Another aspect, as I've kind of hinted to a little bit, is the vocal dialect. This is what separates these animals apart from transient killer whales, and each clan has a different vocal dialect. I have my speaker here. Hopefully it's actually going to work. There we go. And you can actually tell these different clans apart pretty easily, even with your own ear. I kind of think I'm going to play some of them for you, and you'll be able to hear some of the distinct characteristics that separate these groups apart. For the southern residents, for J Clan, I think that they sound very forlorn, just doing sighs, kind of like that, and you can kind of hear that here.
Can you blame them?
Yeah, exactly. This goes on for quite a while, so I'm going to stop it there. They really are tear jerkers. But A Clan, in comparison, for the northern residents, they have a very distinct boing type sound that they do. Oops. There's that boing, and then there's this one too. Our clan, in comparison, they're just screechy. I find listening to them over a long period of time, you just like get a ringing in your ears. almost sound like a parrot's. Really high-pitched one gets to me, gets under my skin. The only way that I can describe G-Clan is they sound like donkeys.
Yeah.
Oh. Oh.
With the squeaks, they got the hee-haws.
So you can see, even with our ears, we can very easily determine which sound belongs to which group. Obviously, if you're a killer whale and your entire world is an acoustic world, you're going to very easily be able to tell these different sounds apart.
I was going to ask you, what about the acoustic range? Like, are there things that we're not hearing that?
Yes, so they are going to have a range that does exceed ours. Very few animals have the exact same range, but yeah, they are going to be able to have hear some sounds that are a little bit higher than we can. But yes.
That's underwater, right? We can't hear them above water.
Yeah, so that is with a hydrophone underwater. If you dunk your head underwater, you would be able to hear those, essentially those same sounds. So yeah.
Did you hear anything, Will?
I didn't hear anything.
That's just Rob was a hydrophone briefly earlier today.
Oh, I thought we weren't saying any names. Wow, cold. Talking about the water. The water must have been cold.
So I've got a question.
Yes.
Can the seals and sea lions and so on tell the difference between the bigs and the residents?
I'm not entirely sure of that one. I would imagine that they probably would be able to. They certainly have the intelligence to be able to tell sounds apart like that. Whether or not they react, I'm not entirely sure what their behavioral response is.
Whatever I've seen doesn't, well, I guess I really haven't been able to distinguish between the different kinds of whales. What I've seen down close to seals and sea lions,
Yeah.
they all just seem to freak out.
Yeah, one aspect, the transient killer whales, they make much less noise for the exact reason that seals and sea lions are going to be able to hear them underwater. If you are a stealth ambush predator, you aren't going to be going around banging cymbals everywhere you go, and that's essentially what the resident killer whales are doing. So, yeah, there is a difference, and I imagine there probably is some behavioral difference. But if you have seen them jump out before, then maybe they're a cautious group. So with the residents, I will just briefly talk about these different vocal dialects. The reason that they have this is, we think, largely to avoid inbreeding. So in the northern residents, these three clans, they aren't going to breed with individuals that sound like them. They want to breed with individuals that sound differently. So when they come together and form these big superpods and these big happy fun balls, let's call them, they are going to try to find someone who's making different sounds than they are. With the J clan, whether or not the different pods are going to have different vocal dialects to use that as a mating preference is not entirely clear, but it is certainly possible. Moving on to the next ecotype, the bigs or transient killer whales. Their population is quite a bit bigger, around 500 individuals, and that number is growing, which is a nice thing to see, but they are still listed as threatened under Canada's Species at Risk Act. And these are marine mammal eaters. They almost exclusively go after things like seals and sea lions. If we take a look at a pie chart of their food preferences, we can see that nearly half of their diet does come from harbor seals. Makes sense. The harbor seal population is doing very well in British Columbia, so there's plenty to find. But there is a pretty sizable portion coming from harbor porpoises, Dall's porpoise, and stellar sea lions as well. In comparison, these animals generally travel in much smaller groups in comparison to the residents. If you think about it, once again, you don't want to be carrying around those cymbals smashing everywhere you go. You're not going to be vocalizing a lot if you are an ambush predator. Similarly, if you're traveling in a large group, it's more likely to be noticed, so traveling in a smaller group is going to be better for hunting. So when you see transient killer whales, it's probably not going to be more than 10 individuals, usually going to look something more like this. Here we have a mother and her children, and then it's her sister as well that are traveling in that smaller group. They're going to be working together, hunting and working together to find their prey. And as I mentioned before, they are mostly silent. If you're sneaking up on a little harbor seal there, you don't want to be making lots of noise, except if, I imagine that they're all singing in their heads, just, I mean, I imagine, I don't know. Then finally, we have the offshore killer whales. We know quite a bit less about these animals because they are offshore. They are a little bit harder to study, but they do seem to have almost a mix of characteristics between the transient killer whales and the resident killer whales. They do travel in fairly large groups, but their social structure doesn't seem to be quite as rigid. There's a little bit more fluidity into where these groups form and how they move about. They are fish eaters. They are mostly going to be eating fish, and they are highly vocal. One thing that's interesting about offshore killer whales, sometimes when they wash ashore, we find that their teeth generally don't look like that. Their teeth, this is what a killer whale tooth is supposed to look like, nice and pointy, good for chomping down on things. But these guys will sometimes wash ashore with very flat teeth that have been worn down. You have to remember that these animals do have a gum line as well, so these teeth are probably barely sticking out of the gum line at that point. Anyone have an idea as to what might be doing that? Yes?
Shark skin.
Yeah, shark skin. Anyone who has felt the skin of a shark before would tell you it feels like sandpaper. That rough surface, as they're biting down on that day after day, is going to wear down on their teeth and eventually getting down to the nubs. Obviously, an animal who had teeth like in that last picture wouldn't be able to hunt very well. However, it was able to survive up until that point, which is a sign that these animals are working together to hunt and then also possibly helping each other feed as well. So shows just how closely bonded these animals are. The offshore killer whales, it seems that they're largely feeding on sharks, not just sharks but rays as well, which also have that kind of sandpaper-like skin. They're closely related. So things like Pacific sleeper shark, blue shark, Pacific spiny dogfish.
What's the range of the offshore?
That one I'm not entirely sure, and I'm not sure if it's entirely known either, because they are so much harder to study. Getting out into that deeper water offshore makes it quite a bit more difficult and quite a bit more costly to study them. So.
When you're talking offshore, you're talking specifically just Pacific Ocean?
Yeah,
offshore?
Pacific Ocean offshore, yeah. So, moving on to our next species. Anyone seen one of these out in the wild? Yeah, that's awesome. These humpback whales are coming back in very large numbers, which is absolutely fantastic. Their numbers had declined very drastically, particularly when whaling was still allowed in Canada, but it seems that their numbers are starting to come back, which is absolutely fantastic. To give you a reference of size, these animals can get up to 15 to 18 meters long, so that's about as long as a school bus and a half, or maybe like one of those big school buses and then one of the little school buses. So very, very large animals. Things to look for other than that humped back, that mass of muscle right behind the dorsal fin, there are some other things to look for. I already mentioned that tall blow. It's a little bit bushy as well, kind of making it look like a cone as it shoots 30 feet up into the air. They also do often show those big broad tail flukes as they go down for a dive. Only animals that go for very deep dives will show those big tail flukes as they go down, and these animals do like to dive fairly deep as they're feeding. So they will show those big tail flukes as they go down for a dive that is much more vertical in comparison to some of the other species. Other things to look for, if you're lucky enough to see the front of the animal, in that rostrum portion, that's kind of the beak or essentially the mouth of the animal, you can look for these bumps right near the front called tubercles. These are essentially modified hair cells. Whales are, in fact, mammals. They do have hair. It's just sometimes that hair doesn't actually poke out of the skin. So these tubercles, it seems that they serve some function in chemosensory, so they're essentially using them to smell underwater to some extent. Also using it for vibrations, kind of like a pair of whiskers. When you think about it, a humpback whale, its blowhole, otherwise its nose, is right here. And then it has these tubercles up front and then its big mouth, right? So it has these hairs, structures, in between its upper lip and its nose. I think we should just start calling these mustache whales. That just seems like the best course of action. These animals, they are baleen whales, so they don't have teeth like the toothed whales do. Instead, they have something called baleen, which is a substance that looks like this. It's made out of keratin, the same substance that your hair and fingernails are made out of. So if you feel your fingernails, that's essentially what this feels like right here. Humpback whales can have 400 of these baleen plates in their mouth at one time. They can get up to 1 meter long as well. Just absolutely massive things. So if you imagine your mouth full of 1 meter long fingernails, then that's what it's like to be a humpback whale. Baleen whales generally are migratory, so they will spend parts of the year in different areas. Around this time of the year, most of the humpbacks are down in Mexico and Hawaii, where they spend their breeding season. That's where they're going to be mating and raising their young. And then they're going to come back up to British Columbia and into Alaska as well for the winter, for the summer when these waters get nice and productive. So we do see that there is quite a bit of a shift in their range over time. These animals, thankfully, are listed as of special concern. They used to be listed as threatened just a couple years ago, so the fact that they were downlisted is absolutely incredible. However, they still do face several threats. I'll talk about some of them later on. Things like competition for food. Obviously, they're going after things like herring, which is a big important fishery in BC and Alaska, but also things like entanglements. These animals have very large flukes and very large pectoral fins that are just primed for getting wrapped up in gear. So this is a bit of a threat to them, and I'll be talking a little bit about that later on. Speaking about those big fins, Megaptera is the genus for these species. Mega meaning big, ptera meaning wing. You can obviously see why. These large pectoral fins can get up to 1/3 of the length of the body of the animal. Just absolutely massive. Why they would have such massive pectoral fins, it seems a little bit odd. Other species have much shorter ones. It might be that female humpback whales just find large pectoral fins particularly attractive. And so it might be a sexual characteristic, essentially, is what that is. But to make up for the fact that they have these massive things carrying through the water, you can imagine it could create quite a bit of drag. They've developed an adaptation to kind of counteract that. You can see this scalloped edge along the leading edge of the pectoral fin. Those kind of act like the dimples on a golf ball. So if you imagine a golf ball has all those dimples in it, when a golf ball is flying through the air, those little divots capture pockets of air and actually help increase its ability to move through that air, increase the laminar flow over top of that golf ball and allow it to fly more efficiently. Now these little scalloped edges, they seem to function in the same way. They capture little swirls of water, little eddies of water, to help increase the laminar flow over top of that pectoral fin, allowing it to glide more smoothly through the water. One thing that is really cool about these guys is that they show why it's so important to study biology, not just because humpback whales are cool and we want to help protect them, but because we can learn a lot for our own use as well. Next time you go past some wind turbines, take a look at the blades of those turbines. You might see a scalloped edge along the leading edge of those turbines. We actually saw these humpbacks, saw that this was a way to increase this flow over top of that and increase the efficiency, added it onto turbines, and it increased the efficiency of these turbines by up to 15 to 20%, which is really, really awesome. So we're able to increase the amount of energy that we're producing through wind power just by studying these humpback whales, which is really, really cool. Yeah.
And they strictly use their tail for propulsion.
Yeah, they're not using those pectoral fins to move themselves through the water. It's only their tail that they're going to be using. They're going to be using their pectoral fins possibly for stunning food, like they might give it a little smack every now and then. And I'll show you some videos, or a picture of that, and I will give you an enactment of how they might use it as well. Just to give you a little bit of a teaser.
These guys do the bubble feeding too.
Yes, yeah, so that is one thing I'll be mentioning as well. One thing that many people know, but I always like to talk about because it's absolutely awesome, is that humpback whale Flukes, the underside of their big, large tails can kind of be used like a human fingerprint to help identify an individual. If you're able to get a good enough photo based off of the different colors, sometimes you can see it's almost entirely black all the way to almost entirely white. Based off of the different colors and scars that they might have on their tail flukes, you can actually identify an individual based off of that. So if you do have a good camera while you're out on the water and you're able to get a good picture, you can upload those to, there's a website called happywhale.com, and it is collecting these pictures, and actually it at first was just using volunteers who would go in and try to identify the whales. It's now using some machine learning, so some artificial intelligence to actually do some of that identifying themselves, which is really, really cool. But that's another way that you can help contribute to citizen science by helping us learn about where these animals are and where they're going. So we had mentioned bubble net feeding before. This is one really cool way that humpbacks will feed. It shows just the amount of intelligence that these animals have. They feed in many different ways, one of which is they do this way of corralling their food by blowing bubbles in a concentric circle, contracting those bubbles closer and closer to bring that prey into a smaller and smaller area so that they can come up underneath and take a big gulp. They're then going to use those baleen plates that close their mouth, open their mouth just a tiny bit, and then bring their tongue to the roof of their mouth. That's going to push all of the water out through the baleen plates, and then they're going to act like a sieve, capturing all of the fish or the krill on the inside of their mouth. They'll then use their tongue to scrape along those baleen plates and shove all of that to the back of their mouth. This video here, you can see an accumulation of seabirds, a good sign that there might be some other sea life close by. And you can see sometimes they do work in concert with other individuals to actually do this bubble net feeding, which is absolutely incredible. Every time I look at this video, I always think when I was growing up, the classic photo of a whale was its big tail fluke coming up out of the water. Nowadays, I'm sure kids growing up, the classic shot of a whale is going to be an aerial shot with the amount of drones that we have out there taking pictures.
I read somewhere not too long ago that they were suggesting that some of that bubble screening group activity is actually a fairly recently learned behavior within the groups.
Yeah, it is. It seems they are able to, once again, pass this information, this way of feeding on from individual to individual. They are capable of learning that. And yeah, it does seem to be a relatively new thing. It does seem to be increasing in frequency as well. Why that might be and where it started and how I'm not entirely sure, but it is a really incredible
Adaptations to environment.
Exactly. If their environment changes, they need to find new ways to feed and different strategies. So this is possibly a more common way of feeding that you see these animals doing called lunge feeding. We can see there's a big herring ball right at the surface here, a sign that there might be something underneath that's coming and hunting for them. Like that big thing. Just showing you how massive these animals' mouths are with those giant ventral pleats. Those are the folds on the throat of the animal that allow it to stretch open and take this huge gulp of water that it can then strain out.
Do they not? I was under the assumption that once they bubble netted, that they came up through the middle of that to lunge feed.
Yeah, it would usually be to do a feeding event like that. In the video that we saw, it might be that they corralled it enough and they all kind of went through the outside because it was multiple individuals together.
So they were just kind of scooping.
Exactly, kind of like scooping along the outsides. It also might have been that it wasn't worth it. They tried to bubble net and there wasn't enough there, so they're just like, they gave up. All right, this is where the reenactment comes in. This was a new technique of feeding that was seen in 2011 in northern Vancouver Island by the Marine Education and Research Society. They saw just 2 individuals doing this. By 2015, that was up to 16. So once again, showing that these animals are able to kind of teach these different ways of feeding to each other. So how this looks is it seems kind of like a little bit of a lazy way of feeding. The animal is sitting vertical in the water. It opens its mouth, and then it uses its flippers to just
Oh, yes. Corral it into its mouth and then just live.
Lazily close and then straighten it out. It might be a good, useful technique for when the prey are fairly disparate. They're not in a very concentrated area. You can imagine it doesn't use much energy to actually just go like this, corral it into your mouth, as opposed to doing that big bubble net feeding. So this might be a new strategy that is increasing in frequency. If you do ever see this, please let us or the Marine Education Research Society know. We would love to hear about that to see how it is spreading out in the world. Yes?
Have you heard about this one? Beth used to work at Discovery Island
Oh, yeah?
Lodge on North Quad.
Oh, awesome, yeah.
And Surge Narrows. So there were a couple, weren't there? Of
Three.
humpback whales, 2 or 3. And they would just float
Against the tide.
Against the tide, they go up, it would be coming at them. They get up to where it was fully, coming at them.
Yeah.
Just open their mouths and float back.
Really?
Yeah. And they did that.
I
for a
haven't
long
seen that.
time.
They just kind of, like you said, and they'd stop with their mouths open, so the current
just
is
let it
just
Yeah.
let go, and then they
Conveyor
slowly
belt it.
back up and they
Some food
close their mouths and I guess filter it out.
So it's like what I do in the shower.
They were there for what, 2-3 hours?
That's incredible.
We stayed out of the
Yeah,
way.
we were well out of the way.
If you do see these types of behaviors, we would love to know about it, because particularly if you get photos or video, that is
But us
fascinating.
do the citation.
Yeah, so there's the info at MERS Society, marineeducationsociety.org, or I'll put my information up at the end of the video as well. I'd love to see that. One other thing, as I'm sure many of you have seen before, humpbacks are absolutely incredible acrobats, launching their entire bodies out of the water.
That's a school bus.
Yeah, that's a school bus and a half launching out of the water, which is incredible. Why they actually do these behaviors, we're not entirely sure. It might be that they're just feeling fancy and just, wanting to do it, a kind of a play type behavior. It also might be communication device. So you imagine as that animal came down crashing onto the water, if you were underwater, it would make a very loud sound as it comes smashing down onto the surface. So maybe they're communicating to other whales over a long distance with these big splashes. It also might be that they're trying to dislodge ectoparasites, so they're essentially scratching. So I mentioned before that these animals have barnacles and whale lice on their skin. It might be that they're just like sick and tired of that blouse, just get off, and it's doing this to try to dislodge it. Not entirely sure, but it could be any of these reasons. All right, that's where I spend most of the time on those two species because they are some of the most commonly seen ones in this region. I am going to talk about some of the other species that we have here. One such is the harbor porpoise. They are much smaller in comparison. They can get just about as long as I am tall, so 1.75 meters, and they are listed as of special concern. These animals are somewhat at risk. They live in very heavily populated areas, so they're sharing habitats with us, putting them at special risk both to pollution as well as competition for space and food. So these animals, people think of them as being very common, but they are listed as a special concern. How to spot them? They're very quiet, they're very docile, they don't seem to like to be around people very often, so usually when you see a harbor porpoise, it's often on a calm day. You'll just see them once or twice surface and then they kind of disappear. Very triangular dorsal fin, all gray back. So they're also generally in fairly small groups, usually no more than 5 individuals are going to be traveling together. They're often confused with this animal here, the Dorsal porpoise, and you can see why. There are quite a few similar characteristics there. Anyone see any differences that you could use to identify them?
White dorsal.
White dorsal fin, that's one of the biggest ones. They're going to have a white or gray part on the trailing end of their dorsal fin. That's a really good one. Anything else?
Chunky.
They're chunky, they certainly are.
Sausages.
They are sausages. They're particularly chunky in this region, right here. That's called the Caudal Peduncle. Great word. Great word. Caudal meaning tail, peduncle meaning mass, so tail mass. That is just a huge amount of muscle that it's going to be using to propel itself through the water. These animals are incredibly fast. They would can easily go over 30 kilometers an hour, very easily passing, getting a speeding ticket if they were in a school zone. Yeah, that's going to be one way that you can tell these animals apart from harbor porpoises as well. You have some competition there. Doing a whale impression.
Dorsal porpoise theme.
It's the Dorsal porpoise theme. So those are some of the ways that you can tell them apart. Yeah, that white frosting, that muscular peduncle, also that white, obviously, on the sides. People often say, "Oh, there goes a baby orca," and it's actually a Dorsal porpoise. One thing that can be very characteristic of these animals is they have a big rooster tail type splash. They're much more energetic, much more likely to do bow riding behavior. I imagine on your sea kayaks you get going quite fast, so that probably bow riding inside you. All right, ready for quiz number 2? Sure. All right, harbor porpoise or Dulles porpoise? Harbor porpoise? What makes you think harbor porpoise?
All black.
All black?
And it's just
Only
really
two.
calm.
Only 2? This might actually even only be 1.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty quiet, slow moving.
Yeah.
No white on the sides.
No caudal peduncle.
No caudal peduncle. All right, here's another one.
He's got quite the peduncle on him.
Oh.
Peduncle.
I think these guys, I think of a harbor porpoise as looking like a little wheel that is coming up and bobbing through the water. I think of Dulles porpoises as looking like a box that is coming through the water. You can see that rooster tail as it flies through the water. Oh, I have the exact same. Oh, here's that showing the box. First the dorsal fin, then the peduncle. Dorsal fin, peduncle.
So are the ones that go along like out of Departure Bay Harbor up in Nanaimo that
Yep.
kind of go with the boats? Are they the?
If they're going with the boat, it's most likely a Dulles porpoise. Yeah,
Oh, is
yeah,
it?
yeah. It's entirely possible that it's a Pacific white-sided dolphin as well. So if they are getting to a little bit longer than this table, then that might be a Pacific white-sided dolphin. They also have a very much larger dorsal fin and very curved as well. So that's something to look for them. I don't have pictures of them on here, unfortunately. There's 23 species I had to pick. Just to make things confusing, there are hybrids. Dulles porpoises and harbor porpoises are able to mate, and they are able to produce young that can then produce young themselves. So they're not like donkeys and horses where they produce a mule that's sterile. They do seem to be able to produce viable offspring, which is particularly bizarre. Whether or not these species should be considered one is a little bit up in the air, but seeing that they generally don't mate together, they do have different behaviors, different niches in the ecosystem. You generally could consider them different species, despite the fact that they are able to interbreed. Occasionally seen, particularly during the shoulder seasons, are the gray whales. They are very hard to mistake because they actually don't really have a dorsal fin. Instead, they have these knuckle-like ridges along their tail, right along the end there. And once again, that very mottled color. They also are often found very close to shore. This is at low tide, and these are the divots of where these gray whales were actually feeding. So these animals aren't going to be taking huge gulps, kind of like a humpback whale. Their baleen is actually only going to be about that long in comparison. They instead are going to be benthic feeders. They're going to be kind of scooping up mud along the bottom of the ocean, and then straining out all the invertebrates that live in that mud through their baleen. That's the foods that they're going to be going for.
We actually saw there's one that lives off of, out of Cabo Bay off Queen Alexandra Beach
Yeah.
area.
Yeah, they're really awesome to see. They come down through here during their migration. They'll come down in early spring as they're coming up to their feeding grounds, and sometimes they will come in right close to shore, which is really, really awesome. I've heard right in Oak Bay as well, they'll sometimes come in and see them right close to shore, which is really, really cool.
I've actually had spray
Oh yeah?
from their blows.
From a gray whale. They stanky. What's really interesting about gray whales is that they used to have a different name. They used to be called devil whales. That's because during the times when we were whaling, these animals fought incredibly fiercely. They were known for being particularly hard to bring down. They would fight like crazy as soon as they were harpooned, really giving it to all of the whalers who were out on the water. Nowadays, particularly in Mexico, in their breeding grounds, they're known to bring their young right up to boats. They are incredibly gentle, incredibly curious animals, and so it seems that, yeah, it's a good thing we changed the name because it doesn't really reflect how we can see them today. But, yes.
Yeah, straining all that mud and rocks and stuff must be hard on their baleen like it is on the shark skin. So, do they grow continuously?
Yeah, in the same way that your hair and fingernails, I feel like my hair maybe a little bit less so than it used to, but yeah, it does grow continuously throughout their lives, so they aren't as at risk of that. But, yes?
I seem to have seen more gray whales about 10 years ago than now. Are there less in our area?
There is some question as to whether or not there is a shift in this Pacific feeding group, if they are coming into the waters less, or if their population numbers are going down. It's not entirely understood yet as to whether or not there is, but there has been some indication that their numbers are changing. Yes?
What time of year is it that we likely to see them around here?
Yeah, it's going to be, this is kind of right at the beginning of when you would start to see them. So it's kind of very early spring is when I usually say. Once you get into summer, they're mostly going to be past by now. Yeah. Moving on to the minke whales. I just have one quick slide on these guys. They aren't, they're not incredibly common, but we do see them fairly frequently in these waters. One easy way to tell them apart is that white bit on their pectoral fin. Notice also how small that pectoral fin is in comparison to the humpback whale. They're much more torpedo-shaped. To give you an idea, these animals are about 9 meters long, so about the same length as a adult male killer whale, so about the same size as a Zodiac boat. And these are the ones that have particularly stinky breath, supposedly. They also seem to be very closely associated with seabirds. Whether or not they're following the seabirds or the seabirds are following them, not entirely sure, but they do seem to work together quite frequently in their feeding tactics. An interesting thing with them.
Are they often solitary?
They generally are solitary.
And one of their things, they'll just sort of sit on the surface and just sit there and breathe for a long time.
Yeah, every now and then they will sometimes do that. I know that with minkies, it's often, from what I've heard with people in ecotourism, is you'll see them for a couple of breaths and then they go off in any which direction, and it's really hard to tell where they're going to go, and making it really hard to find them afterwards. But yeah, most of the baleen whales are generally solitary animals in comparison to the toothed whales, which are much more gregarious generally. So obviously, that isn't all of the species of cetacean that live in British Columbia. These are some of the other resources that you can use to learn about some of the other species. Marine Mammals of British Columbia is one of the best resources I could recommend. Also, we have a couple of resources. One is wildwhales.org. That's our website where we have lots of information about how to identify different species, some more interesting facts about them. Also, the Whale Report app, which is an app that you can download on any smart device has a field guide about how to identify cetacean species. Also a way that you can report any sightings that you have. So I'll be talking about that in just a little bit more. That's the symbol for it right there. If you're looking both on the Google Play Store as well as in iTunes. So I'm going to move on and talk briefly about the threats to cetaceans. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, it isn't a perfect world out there, and these animals are facing many different threats. Different threats that they face are toxins and accumulations of harmful chemicals that are in the waters, a reduction in their food supply. This is one that gets a lot of media attention. Noise and vessel disturbance, another one that gets a lot of attention nowadays, and as well as entanglement and marine debris, which I spoke briefly about before. One, though, that doesn't get talked about a lot is the fact that these animals are still recovering from whaling. It was only in 1967 when whaling was banned in Canada. That wasn't that long ago. And a lot of whales suffered very heavy impacts from this. These are very long-lived animals. All cetaceans are very long-lived. Because of that, it takes them a long time to reach maturity. They don't have offspring very frequently, and the time in between in which they give offspring, it can be quite large. All of this means it can take a really long time for a population to regrow. If you remove a huge amount of cetaceans from a population, it could very drastically impact that population for a very long period of time. This is just looking at sei whales. That's one of the largest whale species, and in total 24,000 whales in 59 years were brought in BC's coast. You can imagine that that had a very large impact, and it might be the reason why we don't see sei whales in these waters very frequently anymore. We do see them every now and then, and I think it was it 1 or 2 years ago where there was one that went all the way down into Puget Sound, which was really exciting to see. It might be a sign that these animals are starting to recover, but as you can imagine, it takes a very, very long time for that to happen.
Is that a baleen whale?
Yes, it's a baleen whale as well. So these guys can get up to over 20 to 25 meters long. They're the second largest whale in the world, second largest animal in the world, I should say, right after the blue whale. I mentioned entanglement as well. Entanglement can be a pretty horrible thing to happen to a cetacean for many different reasons. One, if you're a smaller cetacean or if you're a sea turtle, for instance, an entanglement could mean a drowning event. If you get entangled in a net, it would stop you from coming up and reaching the surface. Obviously, these are mammals. They do need to return to the surface to breathe. If they get entangled, they might not be able to do that. It can also be a problem for some of the larger animals like humpbacks. A study from the Marine Education Research Society found that nearly half of all humpbacks in BC have survived some entanglement event. Just showing how frequent these animals are becoming entangled. And you can see why, particularly with humpbacks. As I mentioned before, those very large pectoral fins and those big tail flukes, it can be very easy for them to become entangled. The thing is, with these guys, it's not going to necessarily stop them from reaching the surface. Instead, it's a little bit more insidious than that. An animal that is getting entangled is going to essentially imagine it as putting on a big backpack full of bricks and carrying that around everywhere you go. Obviously, that is going to be very tiring. You're going to need a lot more energy to be able to do that day in and day out. If you're not able to get enough food to support that extra energy that you have to be outputting, these animals become emaciated and they essentially starve to death. If you do ever see an animal that is entangled, this is the number to call, 1-800-465-4336. That's the BC Marine Mammal Response Network. This isn't just animals that are entangled, but any animal that is in distress. So if it looks like it is struggling to reach the surface, so it's like trying really hard to get to the surface, that might be a sign that it's an animal that is in distress. Also, if you see anybody violating approach distances, that is also considered an animal that's in distress, so this is the number to call. You can see here, it just looks like a very small line that this animal is entangled with, right? It's a big whale, one tiny line, it's probably not that big of a problem. However, this animal is considered in distress. To show you what that looks like underwater, this is how much that animal was entangled.
Yes.
You can't necessarily see all of the entanglements that are happening underwater, so please call that number if you do see any indication that a whale has become entangled. Please also do not try to go and help that whale yourself. I know it can be tempting. You want to get help to that animal as quickly as possible. You have to remember, this animal is as large as a school bus and a half. It is very powerful. It can very easily harm you without it knowing. So make sure that you contact this number. These people are trained to respond to these types of situations. Awesome. Moving on to another threat is reductions in food supply. This is one that is brought up often when talking about the southern resident killer whales. This is a graph here that shows 3 different things. The top 2 graphs are looking at resident killer whale mortality. So if that bar goes above the line, that means that more whales died than were born. If that number goes below the line, that means more whales were born than died. And we can see here, it seems to follow this graph right here, which is Chinook salmon abundance. So if abundance is high, then it's above the line. If it's low, it's below. When the Chinook salmon abundance is high, the population seems to do all right. But as soon as it plummets, like it did between 1995 and 2000, the killer whale mortality in both the southern residents and the northern residents goes up. This opens up a big question for fisheries managers. How do we make sure that there's enough food both for ourselves and also for not just the killer whales, but all the other animals that rely on salmon that are being released into the ocean to make sure that there's enough food for everybody. There are seasonal closures in effect and to try to help mitigate these problems, but it is an ongoing thing that needs to be discussed. Contaminants can be a big problem as well, particularly when you take a look at the southern residents. This is a large graph here, but one of the main things to look at here is the difference between southern residents and northern residents. We can see that southern residents are very highly polluted. The killer whales in the Salish Sea are some of the most polluted whales in the entire world. And you can pretty clearly see why. With Vancouver, Victoria, Seattle, these very large population centers all centered around this area, there's going to be a lot of contaminants that are going to be heading into those waters. Off of anything that's going down the drain, as well as large hotels or farming land is going to release very many chemicals into the water stream, and that is all getting into the ocean as well. And that just goes up the food chain and actually accumulates as it goes up the food chain as well. Small krill eat some of these pollutants. Small fish eats that krill. Larger fish eats that smaller fish. A killer whale eats that big fish, it all gets into their body. They don't actually have a way of getting rid of these contaminants either. The only way that killer whales are able to actually remove these killer whales from their blubber system where it accumulates is through their milk, and so they just pass it on to their young. And that kind of links us to the next problem, particularly for southern residents. They have very low birth rates. In northern residents, there were 10 new calves born in 2018, so they seem to be doing quite well. We also saw that their level of contaminants is quite low in comparison to the southern residents. When we take a look at the southerns, there was one new calf born in 2019. As far as we know, it's still doing all right. It was offspring of L77, but this was the first viable offspring since 2015. So clearly they aren't able to produce young in the same extent for whatever reason, whether or not this is related to the amount of chemicals in their body, if the mothers are offloading that into the young and that's causing the young to die. I can't say for sure, but it's certainly a possibility.
Well, there are many factors, I mean, from
absolutely.
fish to noise.
There isn't, I think it would be foolish to say that there is one single problem that is causing these animals populations to be doing so poorly. It's certainly going to be a combination of many different things, kind of as it is with anything in the natural world. Nothing is simple. All right, so moving on to vessel disturbance. Taking a look at this picture here, we can see many different types of vessels. We see what looks like a ferry or maybe a cruise ship. We have a pleasure craft, and then we have a couple of people in kayaks, and we see some killer whales. Who here thinks the cruise ship has the potential to disturb these animals? Yeah, definitely. Who here thinks the smaller boat has the potential to disturb the animals? Who here thinks the kayaks has the potential? Absolutely does. That's what I like to see, particularly from the sea kayak group. All of these boats have the potential to disrupt these animals, and it's not just through noise. There's many different ways. Just generally interrupting the natural behaviors just with the physical presence of the boat is certainly possible. Collisions and strikes obviously can be a bit of an issue, and then exhaust from vessels can be a problem as well. When you take a look at this critical habitat for the southern resident killer whale, that's the area that's highlighted in blue and green. We can see that it very clearly overlaps with a lot of shipping routes. This can be a bit of a problem, particularly when you're thinking about noise. All toothed whales, all of the whales that have teeth, are going to be using echolocation to try to find their food. They're using that big melon on the front of their head to produce these clicking sounds. Those clicks go out into the water, bounce off their prey, reverberates through the hollow jawbone that they have on the lower part of their jaw and into their ear, And the time difference between that is going to allow them to determine where that animal is. These clicks are very important for these animals to try to find their food. And if they get masked by too many sounds, these animals essentially go blind. So I'm going to play a sound for you here. You're going to be able to hear the killer whales making some sounds, making the clicking sounds, as well as some socialization calls. This is a hydrophone that's in the water, and then 1 kilometer away, a cruise ship comes into view, or into the area that this hydrophone can pick up. It's being blocked by land at first, but then it comes around the corner and you start hearing it produce sound. So it's clicks, that's the echolocation. So that it dying down there, that isn't the boat leaving, that's just the sound turning off for this recording. As you can see, essentially all of the echolocation clicks were entirely masked, and about 90% of the socialization calls were masked as well. And that's with this boat over 1 kilometer away. So you can see that the amount of noise that's being produced underwater certainly can have an impact on these animals, particularly the animals that are going to be using these sounds to actually maneuver and find their food. Some of the larger baleen whales don't use echolocation, but they still do make socialization calls underwater, particularly these low frequency, long distance calls. If those are getting masked by underwater noise as well, that certainly would have the potential to harm these animals as well. There it is again. Disruption of natural behaviors. Many people are lucky enough to have this experience where a killer whale approaches the boat and goes right underneath the boat. I often hear people telling of how it turned on its side and looked directly into their eyes. It's really an awesome experience. The reason that they do this is because they're curious. They want to see what's going on over here. They want to see who you are and what this big honking boat thing is. As they come and do this, it is disrupting their natural behaviors. Who knows what they were doing before they came to investigate. If they were in the middle of a hunt, that could very drastically affect these animals' ability to survive. It was, in a study in 2006, lost feeding opportunities estimated to have caused 18% decrease in energy intake, and that was lost feeding opportunities from disruption just by physical presence of other boats. So we can see that just by boats being close to these animals, it can disrupt their ability to intake food and decrease the amount of energy that they're actually going to be able to intake. So it can be a bit of a problem. Next up, I have vessel collisions. There are a little bit more unsettling images here, just as a bit of a warning. Obviously, if a boat collides with a vessel, it can be quite damaging to an animal, potentially killing it, particularly when it comes to very large vessels. In the sea kayaks that you guys are in, you probably don't have anything to worry about hurting these animals. I'm probably more concerned about you guys. But for some of the larger vessels, a strike with either the propeller or with the vessel's hull can cause very serious damage. Sometimes, as was the case with A109, they do survive, and thankful because as they get cut from, this was probably a vessel, it could cause an infection, could worsen, but as was the case with J34 in 2016, that animal did pass away afterwards. Some of the most commonly struck animals in British Columbia are fin whales and humpback whales. That's because they like to feed along the shelf break particularly on the west of Vancouver Island. And that's the exact same area that shipping lanes travel. These animals also get into a bit of a trance when they're feeding. They don't really think about the sounds that are going on around them. And so a boat, even a very large boat, can actually sneak up on them pretty well. So all of these vessel collisions can certainly be a problem. Yes?
I'm kind of curious about their feeding area.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any talk of moving shipping lanes, we wouldn't have to move the board a couple of miles one way or the other, I would think, to get out of that shelf area? Or?
Potentially, there have been some things. In terms of moving the shipping lanes, the whales don't focus directly on that shelf break in the same way that their food isn't directly on that shelf break, so they could still be in that same area. But there has been the ECHO program trial to slow down through Harrow Strait just in the past couple of years. So that is one thing to try to reduce the amount of noise and the chance of vessel strikes. One thing that we've been working on is the whale report alert system, which I'll talk a little bit more about as well, as a way to try to mitigate the threats of ship strikes as well. So I'll quickly talk about the threats of air pollution. So one thing that is really interesting about whales is that they're really not good at detecting air pollution. For one thing, they don't have sinuses. All the air that they breathe in through their blowhole is going to go directly into their lungs. With us, first it has to go through many different sinuses that can help filter out pollutants that are in the air. In addition, they don't actually have a sense of smell. If you would imagine, a whale doesn't really need a sense of smell. It's going to be holding its breath underwater where all of its prey is. Why would it need a sense of smell? So once it comes to the surface, it's actually not going to be able to smell if there are any pollutants in the air, the same way you or I might be able to. Also, when an animal dives, the pressure on the outside of the animal is going to increase as it goes down deeper into the water. As that pressure increases, that is going to increase the pressure on the air that's in their lungs and force all of the pollutants that might be in that air into their bloodstream. So you can, these animals might actually have more of these pollutants going into their bloodstream than other animals that just lived above the surface. All of these different pollutants can certainly have the potential to have adverse health effects on these animals. We always say to try to limit your viewing time, if you are lucky enough to see whales, to 30 minutes, and make sure that you are following the proper guidelines of not of those approach distances, that you're not getting too close to these animals. All right, enough of the sad stuff. Let's talk about what is being done to help with the research of these animals and help with conservation. So this is just some of the research that we at the Oceanwise Research Institute are doing, centered around cetaceans. First off, we have the killer whale population monitoring and genetics program. This is the longest running study of killer whales in the world, which is really fantastic. It started with just a photo ID guide, but that now has blossomed into doing a photo ID, as well as looking at genetics of these animals. So we're actually able to trace the lineages and trace paternity of which males are the ones who are mating with which females, so that we can see what the genetic diversity of these animals are. That's a really interesting study. We also do photogrammetry work, so we're taking small, quiet drones, flying them quite high distances over top of these animals and taking high-quality photos from above. And with that, we can get a measure of the length of the animal as well as the girth of the animal to see how well that they're doing. So in this picture, it's kind of hard to see, but we can actually see these animals here. These are all healthy-looking whales. They're looking quite plump. This one here is looking very plump. That one's actually pregnant. And then this animal up here is looking a little bit thinner. That one is a little bit more emaciated and likely isn't doing quite as well. We also have the Humpback Monitoring program. I like to call that one the Snotbot program, because we actually have a drone that flies over top of humpbacks and tries to essentially put a petri dish facing upside down directly over top of that humpback's blow. We're trying to collect the snot, the mucus that is coming up out of that animal as they exhale, as they essentially do a giant sneeze is a way of thinking of it. And with that, we're able to get a measure of the types of bacteria that are in these animals' respiratory tract, possibly seeing if they have any harmful bacteria that might be deteriorating their health. There's also the Ocean Pollution Research Program that's looking at different types of plastics that are in the water, how they might be affecting animals. We also have cetacean and habitat use studies. There's one that's happening on Saturna, which I'll be talking about briefly, as well as the BCCSN, the BC Cetacean Sighting Network, the Citizen Science Program, and the Whale Report Alert System. Once again, I'll talk about that in just a second here. So this is research that is all happening in your backyard. So just off East Point on Saturna is where the harbor porpoise, Saturna Island harbor porpoise surveys are taking place. We head out there. This is what my office looks like once a week, which is pretty great. That's on a good day. I'm also there when it's pouring rain, which is a little bit less pleasant. But essentially what we're doing is we're looking for harbor porpoises out there. This has been proposed to be a really important area for mother-calf pairs, particularly an important area for acting like a nursery ground for these mothers to raise their young. So we're doing surveys out there to monitor where these animals are living, whether or not this area is particularly important for them. Finally, onto this whale report alert system. I've been hinting at this one for a while. So this is using all of the sightings that are coming in through the BC Cetacean sighting network. So if you were to go out, download that whale report app, and you saw a whale out on the water, you could report that in with the app. And then commercial mariners who are out on the water, people who are driving particularly large vessels, so things like BC ferries or large tankers, they're set up with a separate app called the Whale Report Alert System. If they come within 10 nautical miles of the sighting that you put in within a certain time frame, they will get a text message. They say, hey, heads up, there's a whale. Open up your app to see where it is. They open up the app. They can then see a map showing where their vessel is using GPS and where that last sighting was in relation to their vessel. They can click on that to look at what species it was. They can see where the animal was heading, what behaviors it was doing. They can then take mitigative measures. So this was an app that was developed with a huge working group. All of these different partners saw the potential for something that could be used to help increase situational awareness out on the water. And I kind of described how it works. You spot a whale, it comes into us, we verify to make sure that it looks correct. The commercial mariners then get a text message. It might also go into an ops center where someone is monitoring a fleet, and then they can radio it in over to their vessels. Once the vessel is aware that there is a cetacean close by, they can then take possible mitigation measures. So they might slow down, they might alter their course so that they're keeping proper distances away from that animal. They might just keep it in mind sometimes if it's a particularly challenging area, like through active pass, just knowing that there are whales there might be just all you need to make sure that you are, and all that you can do to make sure that you are mitigating your threat to these animals. Also, it might be that it came up behind you, so you might just dismiss it. And then at the end of their trip, they are prompted to then show what type of mitigative measures they took while they were out on the water so that we can hopefully get an idea as to how many threats they're mitigating. One study that I'm going to be a part of in the coming months is a survey that's going to be taking place on BC ferries in between Swartz Bay and Tsawwassen. We're going to be on the bridge, and we're essentially going to be looking for cetaceans. The reason for that is we'll be comparing what we see versus what the public sees, and seeing how effective this sightings network is at seeing all of the cetaceans and how good the RAS Whale Report Alert System is at mitigating these threats. So if you want to help contribute to citizen science, you can help by downloading this Whale Report app, reporting your sightings, and then you will be helped to contribute to citizen science, helping us learn more about where these animals are, but also helping to protect that individual whale. By reporting that whale into the sightings network, you may be helping mitigate it from threats of ship strikes or underwater noise. So that's a really awesome thing that you can do. So, what else? Well, I need to put the picture up to make sure that you can see. It's not only the Whale Report app that you can report your sightings in, there's other ways as well. Not all of us have smartphones. You can also report by calling in to 1-866-I-SAW-ONE. I don't know how we lucked out with that number, it seems pretty perfect. You can also email sightings@ocean.org. You can go online to www.wildwhales.org as well. All of these different ways you can report. I'll leave that up there for just a sec. If anyone wants to take a picture, it's also going to be up at the end as well. Yes?
If you don't have, can you do it with the VHS radio? Because even though I carry a phone, I don't necessarily have it on deck.
That is something that we've been talking about. It isn't something that we have set up currently, but yeah, it's something that we certainly are thinking about looking into if you're able to do that. If you are able to report your sightings even later as well, ideally, if you're able to report them in real time with the app, that's the best way, because those are the ones that are going to the Whale Report Alert System. But any way that you can get your sightings in is still greatly appreciated.
And then you'd also have to have
Yeah, some indication of where you are.
So you have to some way of.
Yes, yeah, so
Yeah.
what's nice is that on your app, if it can take your GPS location, and in most of the region here, even when you're not in cell reception, you still have GPS location. So if you report your sighting, it will record your location at that time, and then once you get back into cell reception, you can open up the app again and then just quickly press a button that says ready to submit. You say yes, and then it will go. So it's like a 5-second thing to then submit it afterwards. This is kind of what the app looks like. As I mentioned before, it has a little bit of a cetacean ID guide that you can use to learn more about the cetaceans. You click on one of them, you get a little bit more information that you can scroll down, seeing some other pictures. When you're ready to report, you just fill in a couple of quick questions that gives us some information about where those animals are and what they're doing, and then you can actually see a map of all of your sightings that you've made as well. If this is something that as a group you are interested in doing kind of as a communal activity, one thing that we can set you up with is something called a Sightings Portal. This would allow you to, if everyone says, make sure to say when you log into your whale report app that you are part of the South Islands Sea Kayaking Association. Yes, there it is, good. If you make sure that you are say that you are part of that group, we can set you up with a portal so that you can look at all of your sightings together. And you can just do that by going online and logging in online. You can also then download all of your information, so if you wanted to do any of your own research, or if you wanted to make any of your own maps to see where you're seeing whales and getting some idea of who the top reporter is amongst your group and things like that. These are all things that we'd be able to do as well. Who has the best eyes is, yeah. Yes?
What's the difference between the WRAS pilot and the whale report?
So the RAS, the Whale Report Alert System, that is the system, the app that is exclusively for commercial mariners to let them know when they're close to whales. And then the Whale Report app, that's how you actually report your sightings. Yeah?
BCCSN.
Yeah, it's called Whale Report, but that's the one that's with BCCSN. Yeah. What else can you do to make sure that you are protecting whales? Well, one thing is making sure that you're following proper guidelines for approach distances. These rules have changed fairly recently in Canada. If you're close to southern resident killer whales, you are supposed to not approach an animal closer than 400 meters in their critical habitat. All of the southern the southern island here is considered critical habitat. So an easy thing to remember is it's just 400 meters. That is particularly during the summer months. I think it's in April through October. I'm not sure of the specifics of that, but making sure that you're not approaching killer whales within that distance. Otherwise, if you're outside of the critical habitat or during the off months here, it's 200 meters, so about 2 football fields away is a way to think of that, and then 100 meters for all other marine mammals. Once again, this is to make sure that we are not making too much underwater noise, not disturbing them just with our presence as well. If you do get close to a cetacean in your sea kayak, make sure that you slow down to only 7 knots. That's an important thing to remember. But if you are out on a pleasure craft, to make sure that you do slow down. If you do find yourself close to killer whales, one thing that's important to remember is to make sure that you go on the outside, offshore to the group of killer whales, because these animals actually will corral their prey, both salmon or marine mammals, close to shore. So if you get in between them, you are more likely to disturb them, actually. So it seems a little counterintuitive, but it's better to go on the offshore side of the pond, because that's an important thing to remember.
I was thinking, if you're in a kayak, I mean, it's still a watercraft.
Yes, yeah.
And I know etiquette, if whales approach you, you shut engines and just kind of be quiet and let them pass by.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, I mean, I know Alan had the same experience. I had the day before he got bit by a seal.
Oh.
We had some transients chasing around our kayaks.
Really?
My wife and I, and the next day they went out, and I don't know if you saw the whales, but a couple of seals were nervous enough, jumped on the back of his kayak and
And that can certainly be cause for concern. Yeah, I guess what I would recommend is, yeah, try to discourage the pinnipeds, the seals and sea lions, from trying to get up on sea. Obviously, easier said than done. But if there aren't any seals or sea lions that are around, it's good to slow down, stop, make it raft up if you can.
Okay, that's,
Yeah,
any
let
time
them
that I've
continue.
been closer than the recommended distance,
Mm.
which has probably been 6 or 8 times, it's the whales have approached me.
Oh, absolutely.
Not the other way around.
It's
So
not anyone.
I
who can
tend to
outrun
just
us.
stop and
Yeah.
sit there, so like, is that?
That's not the worst thing to do. If it is a case where you do have a seal that's coming and jumping up.
Yeah, I've
onto
never
your
had a
vessel.
seal, but just, I'll be paddling along, it's like, oh, there's a whale 50 feet away.
Yeah, in
and
that
it's
case.
going around in a circle, and I can only do like 3 or 4 knots.
Oh
so
yeah,
I just
absolutely.
kinda
If
stop.
you're feeling at all concerned for your own safety, yeah, please.
No, I'm
move
not
in
concerned
toward,
about, I always think, well, I'm closer than I'm supposed to be.
Yeah,
So
and-
should
and-
I try and get out of the way? Well, then the whale goes the same way as me.
Yeah,
so-
at that point, there's nothing you can
Okay.
really do. But yeah, I do want to say that if there is a seal coming up, jumping on your vessel, that is increasing the risk to your own safety. So at that point, I would say gently discourage the seal off.
Gently.
Be careful. Seal bites can be very dangerous, actually. They carry a lot of bacteria in their mouths. The seal finger, my supervisor for my master's was telling me how he got a tiny little nip. The next day his hand had swollen to the size of a softball. So it can be quite harmful, so make sure you get that treated if that ever does happen. But then if you do discourage the seal, then try to move into a safe space where you're not going to be disrupting either of the animals'
Which
behaviors.
sounds like on land at that point.
If you can, yeah, ideally, yeah. Other things that you can do, one way to make sure that you aren't disrupting whales is to stay on land. There are many different places around BC that you can see whales from land, a part of the Whale Trail BC signage. These are some of the areas that are common areas where you can see whales just from shore. We try to aiming to put up about 3 of these signs every year, just to increase awareness of all of the different places that you can see cetaceans on land. There's more information about this on wildwhales.org as well. I think with a more updated map. I think this one might be missing some from this past year. So, to give you an idea as to what these signs actually look like, there's lots of different information about the different types of cetaceans and also some of the marine mammals that you can find. I'm not necessarily sure I'd call a river otter a marine mammal, but they do live in the oceans every now and then. So yeah, take a look, keep your eyes open for these types of signs. We're trying to remove them and put them out as much as possible. Once again, another great way to protect cetaceans is if you ever do see a marine mammal or a sea turtle in distress. If you ever see a sea lion who looks like it has become entangled in some fishing wire or something like that, call that number. If you ever see a cetacean that is dead, this is the same number to call as well. If you see an animal that looks like it's trying to struggling to get to the surface, anyone that's entangled, if you see a boat that's chasing a whale, like this boat seems to be doing, or if they are getting too close, that's the same number to call. Yes?
That posting, the slide you had before this one, is it available as a poster?
That large,
Yeah, look.
I don't think it is currently, but yeah, it would be a good one to have. I'll look into whether or not we can develop something like that, because it would be an awesome thing to have. If you do go out to Oak Bay Marina, we have one that is 11 feet by 9 feet. And so if you just peel that off the wall, maybe take that one with you. This is the last slide, but one thing I do want to say beforehand is one final way that you can help protect cetaceans and wildlife in general is share the knowledge that you all have. You are out on the water. You have awesome experiences while you're out there, and I'm sure many of you know quite a bit about the wildlife that you see out there as well. So if you are able to share your passion for the ocean, for the animals that live there, you're going to be able to possibly inspire others to take action as well. whether that not that is just helping to protect the ocean by making ocean safe choices, making sure you're buying sustainable seafood, avoiding throwaway plastics, making sure the clothes that you're wearing, if they are made of plastic, minimizing the amount that you're washing them to avoid microplastics going into the water, avoiding what you're putting, making smarter choices about what you're putting down the drain. These are all ways that we can help create a safer ocean and help protect all of these animals. Yes?
One of the beginning slides, it showed a number of initials as people who funded this.
Oh,
Groups that funded it. Can you maybe tell us?
Yeah, so specifically the BC Citation Sighting Network, or?
Well, at the very beginning.
Oh yeah, so the BC Cetacean Sighting Network, we're all of the Oceanwise Research Institute is entirely externally funded. So while the Vancouver Aquarium is an Oceanwise initiative, that's a separate thing. So we get most of our funding through the government for the most part. So through the Department for Oceans and Fisheries and Transport Canada is where a large amount of our funding comes from. Where else?
There was a third set of initials.
Oh, was
for Canada.
What did
4 initials in a row.
PEMSA? Was it PEMSA? Here, why don't we do this? You know what? This will be a quicker way.
Where was the first or second slide?
This one right here.
Yeah, so it's DFO, TC, and EC.
Oh, Environment Canada is what that's, yeah. Environment and Climate Change Canada is what that one stands for. Yeah. That is all of my presentation. So thank you so much for having me. And if there are other
about, do all whales sleep? If so, where do they sleep and how long do they sleep?
All whales do sleep. They don't necessarily sleep in the same way that we do, though. People say that they turn off half their brain and then continue on. It's not necessarily that they're turning off this side of the brain and then turning off this side of the brain, but when they do sleep, they are turning off portions of their brain, but making sure to maintain the parts that allow them to continue swimming and coming back to the surface. If you see a whale that is moving very slowly, just very gently through the water, about the same speed as you would be going in your kayak or something like that, or if it's just gently coming up to the surface and then coming back down again, that is a sign that a whale is sleeping. Wherever they feel like. They kind of just do it all over. Yeah, there's no specific location.
They went into bays and slept in sort of quiet.
They will generally go to a quiet area. They're not going to go right out in the middle of Juan de Fuca while it's blowing crazy out there. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
I've seen photos and videos of whales, and I forget if they're resting this way or even head down, like totally vertical in the water.
That is one thing that's particularly special with sperm whales. Sperm whales are known to sleep vertically in the water. And it's kind of creepy, truthfully, when you see video or pictures of it, because sperm whales are fairly social animals as well and can live in fairly sizable pods. And they're massive. They're the 4th largest species of whale. And yeah, they will rest vertically underwater and kind of just drift along with the current. It's super bizarre. Yeah, they would just kind of come up like that, or they might come straight up. Their blowhole is not on the top of their head, but it's actually kind of on the front of their head. So resting like this means they can more easily get that dorsal fin, that blowhole out of the water. Yeah.